Hello, good morning. My name is Tim Gould. I am the Chief Energy Economist at the International Energy Agency. Many thanks to the ADB and to our hosts in the government of Hunan province for the opportunity to join you at this prestigious forum and to speak with you on the topic of green recovery and carbon neutrality in a post-COVID era. I'm going to do this with reference to our new IEA World Energy Outlook, our flagship publication that we released last week. A few words of context. Clearly, we're talking at a pivotal moment for the energy and climate debate, a moment when economic recovery is already resulting in some strains on the energy sector with high prices, but also increasing evidence of the changes to our fragile planet being caused by rising emissions. There are unmistakable signs of a new global energy economy emerging, but the shadow of the pandemic still looms large in many countries. This is a moment of high climate ambition, but also of short-term trends that do not match the rhetoric. And for that reason, in the run-up to the COP26 in Glasgow, we wanted to review how far we've come with energy transitions, how far we still need to go, and some of the opportunities and pitfalls that lie along the way. Let us start with the picture on emissions. We come from a situation where we've seen decades of continuous growth with a dip that came as a result of the pandemic, but a strong rebound this year. But if we cast our minds back to a few years ago, before the Paris Agreement was concluded, our expectations for emissions were clear, a steady increase with the world continuing to rely heavily on fossil fuels. And this would have led to catastrophic climate change. However, in the meantime, since Paris, countries have put in place a range of new policies. Technology costs for clean energy have fallen sharply, and China has played a major role in these developments. China's contribution to low-carbon technologies, particularly solar PV, have been driven by the government's increasingly ambitious five-year plans. In practice, they have helped to change the way that many countries around the world think about the future of clean energy. So with the policy settings that we now have in place around the world and the technologies that are coming into the market at scale, we do see a stabilization in global emissions ahead. But the Paris Agreement is very clear that countries need to ratchet up their ambitions over time, and that's what we're seeing in practice in the run-up to COP26. As of today, countries accounting for 50% of emissions have put forward new ambitions for 2030, and countries accounting for nearly 70% of emissions have put forward long-term net zero pledges. And so what we did in the new World Energy Outlook is to ask ourselves, what would happen if all of these pledges were met in full and on time, and what would the implications be for emissions and the energy sector? If that happens, then we do see a turning point in emissions. The global economy continues to grow, but emissions fall by 40% to 2050. This is significant. We've never seen this before in the history of energy. So the question we ask ourselves, is that a turning point for emissions? Is it a turning point for energy markets? So with today's policy settings, our so-called stated policy scenario, the near-term future looks a lot like the past. Continued growth for all the major fuels, continued rapid expansion in solar PV and wind alongside growth in other low emissions technologies. But if we factor in those announced pledges, that does change the picture for energy. Already by 2025, a flattening in global oil demand and then a slight decline. A key reason for that is the accelerated pace of sales of electric vehicles that we see in China, in Europe, and in some other markets already, but that would become a much broader phenomenon in this scenario. A similar trajectory for gas at global level, largely due to changes in the electricity sector, that moves gas gradually towards a balancing role in markets rather than a baseload role. And then an even more rapid expansion of key renewable technologies. Announced pledges also change the picture for coal. The number of new build plants is tailing off rapidly in many parts of the world. Finance for new coal plants is becoming increasingly scarce, especially after the announcement by President Xi Jinping that China would not build new coal-fired power plants abroad. However, there are still emissions coming from the large stock of existing coal-fired plants in this scenario. And this is one of the key reasons why the emissions trajectory associated with announced pledges is still much higher than what we would need to achieve under a 1.5 degree stabilization in global temperatures. So, and particularly if we look at the picture in 2030, these announced pledges would cover only around 20% of the gap to a 1.5 degree outcome. So what I wanted to look at now is what more could be done to close that gap. And a major part of our analysis in the new World Energy Outlook is precisely on this topic. And a key finding for us is that actually 40% of the additional global emissions reduction that would be required to move us on to that 1.5 degree pathway are cost effective, meaning that they result in overall cost savings. It's tough, therefore, for us to understand why these additional reductions are not on the table in Glasgow from all countries around the world. There is no economic rationale for holding back. So what are these additional elements? First and foremost, it's an additional boost to deployment of low-cost wind, low-cost solar PV, as well as other low-emission sources, including nuclear power in some countries. This would allow for a much more rapid reduction in reliance on existing coal plants and bring down emissions. Another very cost-effective approach is to bring down methane emissions from fossil fuel operations. Methane, as we're all aware, a very potent greenhouse gas, and at a time when gas prices are where they are today, very high levels, it is really inexplicable that around 180 billion cubic meters in our estimation of gas each year escapes to the atmosphere from fossil fuel operations. Many of these emissions are extremely cost effective to abate. Similar story for energy efficiency, and there are multiple cost-effective ways to improve performance in this area, as well as opportunities to push electrification even harder. I'd like to conclude by returning to a global context with one word of warning and one word of encouragement about the road that lies ahead. First, a warning on investment. For many years now, the World Energy Outlook has warned of a potential mismatch between investment in different parts of the energy sector. And in the case of oil and gas, upstream investment is now half of where it was in 2014, while oil and gas demand has not changed to anything like the same extent. In fact, spending on oil and gas production in 2020 and 2021 is broadly aligned with where we would need to be in our net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. And let's remind ourselves that that is a scenario that sees oil and gas demand falling quite rapidly. But on the other hand, investment in clean energy technologies and related infrastructure, it's rising slowly, but it's nowhere near where it would need to be to reach alignment with that net zero scenario. What we're seeing in energy markets today is not related to clean energy transitions or climate policies. But the mismatch you're looking at on the screen does create risks for the future. The way forward is clear, a major boost in clean energy investment across all technologies, across all markets. But as long as this mismatch that you're looking at on the screen persists, there will be a strong risk of further sharp price swings and increased volatility in the future. But to conclude, a word of encouragement on what such an increased investment would bring as we move into a new global energy economy. And what we wanted to illustrate on this slide is that if the world gets on track for net zero emissions by 2050, then the cumulative market opportunity for manufacturers of wind turbines, solar PV models, battery packs, electrolyzers, and fuel cells would amount to some $27 trillion between now and mid-century. And these 5 equipment markets alone would be of a comparable size to today's oil market by 2050. And that's clearly an enormous opportunity for companies that are well positioned along a growing set of global supply chains. And we need to keep this in mind as we step up our efforts to address our common climate challenge. So let me leave you with this, a reminder of the huge opportunities for growth and employment of the move to a net zero emission system and a new global energy economy. And with that, many thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today. Thank you very much indeed.